so hi, my name is Sebastian Budin. I'm a founding member of Historical Materialism Journal and the book series and the conferences, some of which you will already be familiar with. So I wanted just to pitch to you the idea of you subscribing to the journal. Firstly, the journal comes out 4 times a year, published by Brill, over 1,000 pages of extremely important and stimulating Marxist theory and Marxist history. We have a discount at the moment for individual subscribers around the time of the London conference, and we very strongly both request and demand that you subscribe to the journal, that you get other people to subscribe to the journal, and of course that you get your institution, if you're part of a university or other institutions, to subscribe to the journal. We need more subscribers for this project to be able to expand and continue. The second thing I really wanted to push was the book series. The book series you also probably be familiar with. It's published by Brill Academic Press, and the volumes come out 12 months later with Haymarket Books in Chicago, paperbacks. We have more than 200 volumes published now, of translations, of original work, of document collections, of translations from Marxist theory from across the world, from Japan to China to India to Latin America, very important Latin American list shaping up in the book series, and so on. It's a really crucial intervention in Marxist literature and in making Marxist theory available. That really hasn't existed on this scale since the 1970s. So we'd like you to look at the book series, buy individual volumes, perhaps take up the offer of the book club that Haymarket is promoting, and also, of course, if you're part of an institution, to get your institution to buy as many volumes as possible. Those are the 2 key elements of our activity, aside from the conference, the journal and the book series. And we think it would be, it's essential basically for us, for our existence, for us to be able to continue to thrive, for those to expand. So please subscribe to the journal, buy the books in the book series, publicize both around you, and help us build the Historical Materialism project.
Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, or depending on the time zone. My name is Panayotis Sotiris, and I'm a member of the editorial board of Historical Materialism Journal. And I'm glad to welcome you to this last session of the Historical Materialism 2021 online conference. A conference that we hope it is the last one that we have in this format. And the next time that we have the conference is in London in 2022, and the final plenary, which as this panel was supposed to be, is in a big room with real people present. Anyway, before I present our panel, just to remind what Sebastian Budin, or more precisely Sebastian Budin's avatar, just told you, the need to support the Historical Materialism project, beginning with subscribing to the journal. 4 volumes, 1,000 pages of exciting Marxist theory each year for less than 60 euros if you take advantage of the offer that is still going on. And of course, buy the books at Haymarket. 40% off until the end of the conference, which is now is the time also to order some books at really affordable prices. And if you are affiliated to any institution, also get them to have institutional subscriptions to both the journal and the book series. And please also donate to Historical Materialism through the Eventbrite events. There was also a link to a possibility to donate. There are costs for the conference, there are costs for the entire project, and we really need your support. Also, some words of thank you. First of all, to everyone who has participated, submitted a paper, and took part in this conference, and also attended it. It was really good to have all these discussions and presentations. To the editorial board and particular Paul for the help they've given in regards to the technical aspects and running the conference. To Haymarket, our partners in struggle and in crime in a certain way, because they have offered us the support, the technical support we needed to have this online conference, and in particular to John MacDonald. Well, yeah, I think these are the thanks we had to give. And now our panel tonight is entitled The Fascist Horizon, Theoretical and Political Perspective. And we have 5 comrades with us, Lise Benoist from Uppsala University and the Zetkin Collective. And you should read, if you haven't read already, the book by Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective, White Skin, Black Fuel on the Danger of Fossil Fascism. We have Sabrina Fernandes, a postdoctoral fellow with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. We have Andreas Malm from Lund University and the Zetkin Collective. We have Ugo Paletta from the University of Lille and Contretemps, the very important online Marxist journal in France. And you should check, by the way, Ugo's text published about a year ago, Fascism, Fascisation, Anti-fascism, on the historical materialism journal, website. And Alberto Toscano from Goldsmiths, University of London, and Simon Fraser University, but also, of course, from the editorial board of historical materials. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes maximum, so that there is time for discussion. Our viewers can put questions and comments in the YouTube chat, and we will relay them to the presenters so that they can answer or comment or discuss them. So without further ado, I give the floor to Lise Benoist.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. I hope you hear me well, and if you don't, because it's cutting, please let me know and I can try to turn off my camera or something. So I'm going to talk, so I'm indeed part of the Zetkin Collective, and I did research on France, and more specifically on far-right ecology. But right now it feels a bit distant from the theme of the panel. I hope that by the end of my talk, the topic feels far-right ecology will feel very much relevant for when we speak about Fascism Horizon. And yeah, so I'm going to try to explain or answer the question or talk about this at least at large. How can the topic of ecology/climate can and is contributing to the fascisation of the political landscape, and could even more in the future. So I'll work with my research to introduce the topic, maybe add a couple of updates if I have time, and then conclude with some points for the discussion. The starting point for our work with the collective was to look at 2 trends. The first, the rise of far-right parties around the world, and on the other hand, the accelerating global and climate and environmental crisis. And we wanted to look at the intersection, so the climate politics of the far-right. And I specifically looked at the case of France, which stands out because while most of the far-right parties adopt a climate denialist position, France seems to have taken the path of green nationalism, turning their aversion of immigration into a climate-friendly measure. And the context when I did the research was 2019, when Jordan Bardella, so number 2 back then at the Rassemblement National, said that the best ally of ecology is the border, and presenting immigration and environmental challenge as the 2 major issues for the 21st century. So the EU elections to the EU Parliament, the Rassemblement National published a manifesto aiming to create a European ecological civilization and introducing keywords of their ecological program, localism and rootedness. So, and this was also the year, obviously, of the Christchurch killing by the eco-fascist terrorist Brenton Tarrant in New Zealand, who assassinated 51 people in 2 mosques. And in his great place that green nationalism was the only true nationalism. So for the research that I did, I looked at beyond, I wanted to look beyond the far right, the tip of the far right iceberg. So instead of looking into parliamentary politics, I looked at the metapolitical sphere. And it is composed of countless media outlets and organizations, online and presential, training institutions, re-information channels, and all different types of media. And the goal of sphere is the cultural battle outside of parliamentary politics, because the underlying assumption is that ideological change is a precondition for political transformation. And they like to call themselves Gramscianists of the right. So I wanted to look at this sphere, because obviously it's two communicating vessels. And this metapolitical sphere contributes to the normalization of far-right narratives, eventually their success in electoral. I want to look at what are the discourses around ecology in this sphere. And I analyzed over 100 articles between 2019 2020, and wanted to identify the main themes around the topic of ecology. I'm going to go through them. The first one is, and it's based on the quotes, some quotes that I retrieved from the article. And the first one is, maybe our world children will be too hot, maybe they will be too cold, we have no clue. And this into, even if we think that there is no climate denialism left in this green nationalism paradigm, there still is very much some typical climate denialist quotes, such as CO2 is good, warmer temperature are actually nice, climate has always changed, and there's a strong denial still of the responsibility of who caused climate change, and response that we need to, like what kind of actions and the different implications. They also say that there are too many uncertainties and that we need a real debate. Then a second discourse is climate manipulation, quotation mark. We need to promote reason over what they call the Thunbergian dogma. So in reference to Greta Thunberg. And here ecology, in their view, is understood as a new religion. So they think that climate denialists or climate, that people who oppose the IPCC, for example, and the climate science in general, or dissidents of the climate orthodoxy, they claim that ecology has become an apocalyptic faith and a new religion, what they call ecologism. So there's a strong criticism of the IPCC, of Greta Thunberg, who's considered as a climatic guru, an eco-catastrophic shaman. Fridays for Futures marches are considered as crusades. And of course, her as a person is undergoing a lot of criticism, considered as a school striking girl, ill-mannered, and who should be sent back to school by her parents. And she's both manipulated by the green capitalists and manipulating a lot of people. And so instead of this highly irrational religion, they claim that we should oppose reason, pragmatism, scientific rationality, and common sense. And the third discourse is that ecology or green is the new red, I say, that ecology is actually a new communism and a new form of totalitarianism. And what's behind this, and maybe we can talk about this in discussion, is that ecology is perceived as the spread of left-wing ecology at large as a confusing neo-Marxist mismatch typical of far-left globalists, because to them, they think that globalist ecology is synonym of multiculturalism, progressive ideology, that it's just a strategy to make people feel guilty and burden the European history and greatness of the European past, because the European genius can face this crisis and find new technology to overcome the crisis. And all of this left-wing ideology would anyway conduct or drive to the de-virilization of the world, and it would be an organized suicide of a civilization. That's Marxism has mutated into this ecologism, and they even consider us, or like the ecology, environmental movement, as green fascists, which is slightly ironic. And then the fourth discourse is, and one very important for us now today, that demographics is the world's major ecological issue, so that the ecology should be about population control. This left-wing ecology is portrayed as a great diversion in front of the migratory invasion, and the taboo topic of rampant population growth considered, so those two are considered as two major ecological challenges. But obviously when they speak about overpopulation, it's never overpopulation in Europe, but it's Asia and in Africa mainly. So the idea is that Africans should stay in Africa because they produce less CO2 than once they adopt a European lifestyle. So this kind of claims when they speak about population, and therefore borders would not protect nature because they would preserve human diversity. So here it's also a central concept behind far-right ecology, this idea of ethno-pluralism or ethno-differentialism, that different cultures should stay in their natural territory, and that cultures are incompatible with each other. So it's both ethno-differentialist and a strong neo-Malthusianist view on ecology and on populations. And the fifth discourse is that an authentic ecology must reconnect the physical link that binds man to his land. So this is very like a strong discourse that ecology should be about rootedness, rooted in a local territory, or even regional or local, that is both understood as socially and geographically. So a local environment that is dwelt by its natural inhabitants. And this would be most frequent to maintain this local is to have the natural nuclear family that serves as a core that can ensure the transmission of the traditions and the culture, to protect the heritage and the history and overall the identity of different peoples. Then, so therefore the protection of ecosystems is indissociable from the preservation of the sovereignty over a territory, making borders necessary in their view. And so this idea of rootedness is combined to a romantic vision of the land, of the landscape, seen as a cultural and national heritage, and therefore there's a strong opposition to wind turbines, for example, but to renewable energy at large, while nuclear power stations are often considered as already there and already part of our heritage, and to quote, just like the Versailles Castle or the Eiffel Tower. So this idea that nuclear power there, however, belongs to the national identity in a way. And then the last discourse is that the real ecology knows no party, so that ecology should neither be nor left nor right, and that the real divide is between the localists and the globalists. There are also some of them or some of the articles and some of the journals or magazines that I looked at, they also say that ecology is in first and foremost right-wing, actually, but there's a higher proportion that say that it's beyond this left-right divide, and that the real divide is between the ones who want to protect identity and the one who want to destroy it. However, this is also the way into anti-consumerist, anti-capitalist discourses, even a right-wing version of degrowth and degrowth vocabulary, at least an advocacy, and the idea of limits to resources, but also to human nature. So if I would conclude all of this, or summarize all courses, we can see that ecology is used to reinforce variations of identitarian, rooted in human conceptions of ecology, which is based on the naturalization of social processes, and then which allow to define what is natural and therefore legitimate from what is not. And this is both based on and feeding eco-fascist narratives that we can see rising today. And these conceptions justify profoundly ignorant, as I said, but also anti-egalitarian and conservative vision of the world, and allow for the instrumentalization of ecology to serve nationalist and cultural racist agendas of closed borders. So I'm not sure how much time I have. Maybe someone could tell me.
You have 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, then I'll keep some updates for the discussion on some developments at the Rassemblement National and also on the new character that we have, Eric Zemmour, who's a bit diverging from this trend, so we can talk about that later. But overall, and what I want to bring to the discussion is that green nationalism as a narrative might become increasingly attractive as the ecological crisis intensifies, because it might be just harder and harder to deny the reality of climate change. That we need to oppose these ecological narratives that are not green, because first, not only do they not mention at any time fossil fuels, but as rightly pointed out in an article on eco-bordering, so a bit similar to what green nationalism is, they really portray immigration as the cause of climate change and not as a consequence. So that's maybe an argument that we can emphasize when we want to deconstruct these narratives. And and obviously romanticize exclusive white eco-villages are not going to help solve the crisis, which is obviously a global issue. And on top of that, we obviously need to reaffirm left-wing values of solidarity and justice when we speak about ecology, along with a real anti-capitalist project, because I think what should be a real danger, what is a real danger now and already is that this type of ambiguity, neither left nor right type of ecology, can give rise to alliances and can become tempting, people, the appropriation of vocabulary such as the local and degrowth keywords, for example, it might have some effect in survivalist circles and all of this. So we need to repoliticize the crisis, and when we speak about the local, of course, we need to have the local and focus on, but we need to always think about it in the pictures, and so that there are no room for alliances. And we have seen now there's maybe we can talk about that as well in the discussion. But recently there was a candidate to the primaries of the Greens that was openly portraying himself as neither right nor left and having potentially problematic discourses. And there's another candidate who is wants to break the taboo of demography. And so we have to be aware of this type of narratives. And of course that we need to keep monitoring far politics, far climate politics, with the intersectional lenses, because we see that far ecology is, if not only about race, it is also about gender. That's it. And I'm happy to say a few words about Eric Zemmour, maybe after Hugo spoke about it later.
Thanks a lot, Lise. And I give the floor to Sabrina Fernandes. And the title of your presentation is Dependent Capitalism and its Authoritarian Phase in Brazil. And please, we apologize for some problems we have. This have to do with bandwidth. It's beyond our means to control them, yet we apologize.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about Brazil, but I'm going to leave this a little bit more to the tangents and more at the end. Like I'm thinking more of a larger framework on how authoritarianism is reflected in many levels when we're talking about countries that are in a situation-dependent capitalism, right? So underdeveloped or sometimes seen as developing emergent countries, and how the relationship is quite different from some of these expressions of authoritarianism that we have seen in more established capitalist economies. But also in the sense that I'm choosing to talk about authoritarianism here, particularly, and not just the fascist experience, because in my research, I've been trying to connect some of these experiences in the global South, mostly in Latin America, of practices that actually carry forward when you have the moderate left in power engaging with these authoritarian practices. And if the far right jumps in with a fascist project, they tend to take advantage of some of these practices, some of the experiences that are already quite established. So I think the main point to begin with here is that authoritarianism is not exclusive to the far right. Drawing mostly here from Florestan Fernandes, main Brazilian sociologist that has just discussed this at length. But we have this understanding that the far right is not just authoritarian, but it excels at it, and it does not treat it as simply a means to an end, but authoritarianism is directly at the core of its project. And this way, we're going to have a difference from when the left engages in authoritarian practices, because when the left does so, it is actually engaging in contradictions, things that will not go forward with an anti-capitalist program or a program to reinforce human rights. And if we're talking about the socialist left, is actually denying a project of emancipation. What we have in the case of these countries with dependent capitalism is that these authoritarian tactics, they're usually used because there's an attempt to strike a balance between consent and coercion when trying to negotiate among different interests. So for example, if we take the moderate left in Latin America and we take experiences within the pink tide and we look into like Bolivia, Ecuador, and Brazil, for example, we're going to have to look into these big developmentalist projects that are put forward as a way to actually make the nation advance, to actually get people out of poverty, create jobs and things like that. But these projects, they come with a lot of contradictions. For example, huge destruction of the ecosystems around them. And I think in this sense, this quite relates to some of the points that Lise was making earlier. But we could talk, for example, about the problem of mass incarceration under the PT government in Brazil. So a government that was pushing to end hunger, to end poverty, but actually promoted a whole system around the war on drugs that made incarcerating levels really rise in the country. So that would also be characterized as a matter of these authoritarian tactics and practices. They are part of the system, even though it's a leftist government in power. But when the far right comes in, this whole system is merged with what would have to understand in the concept of sovereignty. And I think this is where things really do change. Countries that are in a situation of dependent capitalism is not just because these are the countries where the economy is very much focused on exporting commodities. This is certainly a main element of this. It is where GDP growth is located. It's where you find a lot of these economic policies concentrated to make sure that these exports go on. And obviously, these are countries where industrialization has not really been fulfilled. So this creates a whole other level of vulnerability. So for example, if there is an imperialist blockade or something like that, when you're trying to promote a more radical left government, then if the country is not properly industrialized in key areas, then it generates vulnerabilities, it can generate shortages and things like that. But something that's important for us to understand is that dependent capitalism is very much related to the way the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class in that country, it's not actually committed to a national project. So it's not committed towards sovereignty. And then you find issues, for example, the nationalism that plays out in a place like Brazil when Jair Bolsonaro got elected, and using things about like Brazil above everyone, God above everything, and expressing a lot through the Brazilian flag that has like order and progress there, and then people really using the sense of Brazilian nationalism as a way to promote what is best for the country, and in the sense of what is best for in a patriarchal sense, in a white supremacist sense as well. It's quite logical when you're talking about certain values. But when you're talking about the political economic approaches coming from these experiences, they're really approaches that are quite embedded into neoliberal policies, and they're embedded into making deals with countries that are more powerful, that hold economic power over the dependent countries. So here you find this very unequal dynamic going on. So that's why in Brazil, you're going to find Bolsonaro promoting the Brazilian flag, things like what it means to be a Brazilian, and this nationalism is quite strong in the sense of values. But in terms of economic policies, he was very close to the Trump government. And even though there are differences between what Bolsonaro has been doing in connection to Biden, for example, Biden did not think twice about sending envoys to Brazil to try to negotiate and make sure that the Brazil would stand with the United States against getting 5G from China. So these interests, then they become aligned at the political economic level when it comes to the federal government. And it then is another example that we find of this is the actual oil policies that we have in Brazil right now, right? So Brazil is an oil producer. It has a national company, Petrobras, that produces oil. It is it's sort of like mixed economy because it's like majority, the majority of it is owned by Brazilians, by the state, but obviously you have a lot of other shareholders. And after the coup against Dilma Rousseff, Petrobras changed its policy on prices to be connected to actually the exporting of oil. So this means that dollar is actually the way that the price is calculated within Brazil. And with the currency real being so devalued, this means that gas prices are going through the roof. And this affects a lot of the Brazilian population. And this also affects even prices for food. So then you're going to have like this snowballing effect around inflation. And then you're going to have a huge problem with hunger, which is the current situation. So food insecurity is something that affects at least half of the Brazilian population today. So we're talking about over 100 million people. So people who are not sure if they can have proper meals. But hunger is something that's affecting millions of people. Now, even though we were coming from a process where the Workers' Party had done quite a decent work in terms of fighting hunger, combating hunger. What we find here then is that this priority of the dependent capitalist class is above everything else, because at the same time that people are going hungry, or at the same time that over 600,000 people died from the pandemic, this is followed by really, really high profits in the agribusiness sector. So even like we've seen in some sectors in particular, like record high profits within the last 2 decades. And then you put it all together and you find that this is part of a system of authoritarianism in the far right that wants to ensure that you can have repression when necessary, and you can engage in other ways of repression that don't come directly through the government. So in the case of Bolsonaro, it means making sure that more people can access guns. So he has issued the decrees in that sense, and the number of guns bought in the country, bought and registered in the country, grew by a lot. And this presents a very direct risk to populations in rural areas and a very direct risk to indigenous communities. So under Bolsonaro, we have seen a spike in the assassination of indigenous leaders and other types of violence against indigenous communities as well. So this is not repression that comes directly from the government, but it's enabled by the government in the system of authoritarianism that counts on a lot of partners. It's not reliant just on direct state power. This comes with the direct destruction of nature as well. So Brazil has become well known in the past few years because of the deforestation of the Amazon, fires in other biomes as well, and climate denialism being at the forefront of the discourse of both the foreign minister and Ernesto Araújo in the past, or of Ricardo Salles, the former Minister of the Environment as well. But it's not as simple to just say, well, here you have like they're fascist and they're anti-scientific and they're promoting this type of denialism, when in fact, this is again, part of the project of maintaining Brazil in a system of dependent capitalism, because you can go ahead and you can dismantle environmental policies, you can repress the movements that have like this ecological approach, you can make it really hard to rebuild these things, and in the meantime, the political project entails rebuilding some of these policies and initiatives through neoliberal policies. So, for example, carbon markets. So, at the same time that the government was promoting climate denialism, part of the Ministry of the Environment was involved in creating new mechanisms for offsetting through forests that agribusiness could engage with. So agribusiness would be able to take a huge part of the land. They would be able to take down forests to be able to grow monocrops. Monocrops, they are mostly for commodities. And then this is not feeding the people in the country. They're making record high profits from this. And the little forest that's left is actually quite convenient in some sense, because not everything that's inside these huge properties is actually available to be exploited for monocrops. So they would keep some of these native forests anyway, and they would use that as a way to sell credits. So this way you really do reconcile a lot of these interests in terms of like destroying, but also taking the most profit out of everything. And this becomes quite normalized once the neoliberal policies come to the forefront, because what we see right now is that the Bolsonaro government is known for its repression, for censorship, for fake news, for denialism, but it's mostly known for standing together with these very well-established capitalist class in the country, both on the industrial side and the agribusiness side. So, for example, there were a COP26 right now, and the government pavilion was directly sponsored by agribusiness and industry associations that want to make sure that the financial sector is completely structured around these carbon mechanisms within Brazil, but also expecting the negotiations around Article 6, paragraph 4 of the rulebook for the Paris Agreement, to make sure that they would profit from a larger carbon market mechanism as well in that sense. So what we see here is that they are very much aligned in these interests. So when we have this level of repression, when incarceration is on the rise, when the government is very militaristic, so like the military is directly within the Bolsonaro government, that's not just about exerting violence out of the sake of violence, but violence is part of it, but it has to serve this very, very much subordinated interest of the Brazilian capitalist class. And that's part of the scenario that we find in Latin America when there was the coup in Bolivia and Janine Áñez took over. It's also the scenario with the Piñera government in Chile, is what you find in these in the same experiences with Ivan Duque in exert power by making sure that its economic relationships to other corporations, to shareholders and financial institutions in the global north, in the richer nations, those are maintained intact or can even be improved upon. So I'm just going to close around this because I think I'm getting closer to the 15 minutes here. And if there are any questions later, we can take that on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sabrina. And the floor now to Hugo Palletta.
Thanks very much for the invitation to speak on this panel about a crucial issue of our times, especially in the French context right now, where we see undoubtedly, I think, a rise of neo-fascist ideas or a new step. especially in the public debate, and a left which experienced a huge difficulty to respond, and especially to connect its project to working class aspirations. But I don't want to give a description of the French situation in this panel. I'd like to tackle a more general problem. Working on neo-fascism for some time now, I have begun to use more and more the concept of fascisation these last years, and I would like to reflect on what it can mean to use it for our understanding of fascism, and especially anti-fascism. To my knowledge, the concept of fascisation hasn't been a central theoretical tool used by the classical Marxists of the interwar period, who are perceived as those who understood the more clearly what fascism was about and the specific danger it represented, especially Trotsky, Thalheimer, or even Daniel Guérin. I think the main reason for this is that the concept of fascisation was quite intensively used by the leadership of the official communist movement, that is by the Stalinist bureaucracy during the so-called third period. And as we know, it was used in such a loose and unclear way that the Communist International was treating not only bourgeois government as fascist, and not only the capitalist state as already fascist, but also social democratic parties as the left wing of fascism. Trotsky has legitimately ridiculed these claims, but we might lose something by denying any analytical and practical power to the concept of fascisation. It's quite obvious, in my view, that using this concept doesn't necessarily lead to the idea that every pro-capitalist organization would be fascist or proto-fascist, or that the bourgeois state would be already fascist when we experience, for instance, an intensification of state repressions. Talking about fascisation doesn't mean either that the process leading to a fascist dictatorship should be considered as a gradual one or organic one. It just means that fascism doesn't appear suddenly like a lightning in a clear sky, or as a simple choice made by the ruling class at some precise moment when it faces some revolutionary threats. One of the great benefits, I think, of the concept of fascisation is that it forces us to look closely not only at the precise moment where fascists are able to win the political power, but at the social-political transformation that enable the rise of fascism and at last the fascist victory. The other benefit is to draw our attention to non-fascist organizations or ideologues or institutions that plays in favor of fascism, taking seriously the idea that fascism is not only about fascist organizations taking the state and beating the left electorally or in the streets, but is rooted in the process of contradictory reproduction of capitalism. So fascisation shouldn't be understood simply as the growing presence of fascist activists in a repressive state apparatus or in mainstream parties, but also and mostly actually as some qualitative transformations in the way these state apparatus function, and in the dominant and also counter-hegemonic ideologies. This means we need to integrate more carefully in our understanding of fascism the role of oppressions and labor market competition, ideologies and political crisis, unequal development and environmental crisis, psychoaffective structures, and so on. And we have to say that some of the best insights that came from Marxists after the interwar period were precisely about these kind of things, trying to move away from an instrumental and economicist understanding of fascism as some kind of plot prepared by finance capital or by the most reactionary, imperialist and chauvinistic fraction of capital, to use the words of Dimitrov in its report for the 7th Congress of the Communist International. So my hypothesis here is that to understand any fascist dynamics, we need to articulate a theory of fascisation and a theory of fascism, and both are difficult tasks. On one side, the theory of fascisation should mostly highlight the continuities between fascism and capitalist formations, not only what is easily considered as pre-fascism, like state authoritarianism. Let's think about the Papen or Schleicher governments in Germany before 1933, but also long-term continuities, like, for instance, the way anti-Semitism shaped the political culture of European countries from the last decades of the 19th century, or white supremacism in the US after the war. More precisely, a theory of fascisation should give elements to answer a double question. What are the processes and concrete mechanisms that prepare the ground for the rise and victory of fascism? And once they won political power, what are the processes and conditions that lead to a real fascist dictatorship, which means a real transformation of the capitalist state? As we know, but also by experiences from the left, that is winning the political power is one thing, transforming the state is another one. On the other side, a theory of fascism should try to emphasize the specificity of fascism and shed some light on at least three things. The fascist project, which means its ideological core, but also the different strategy through which it works concretely from inside the common sense of the masses, how it can shape it in specific directions, etc. The fascist organization, which is way more diverse and contradictory than we are used to think, even if we look only at interwar fascisms. And the fascist state, with all the complexity that historians have highlighted, also Poulantzas, obviously, especially when studying the way decisions were taken in fascist states. The difficulty for any theory of fascism is to combine, I would say, generic aspects of fascism and historical processes through which concrete fascism are shaped, transformed, etc. Let's say trajectories of fascisms, which differ from one country to another, from one historical context to another. At the point that the checklist definitions of fascisms are more or less useless most of the times. I'm sorry for these very general considerations, but I hope it can be useful to tackle the issue of anti-fascism. I'm quite sure we agree here on the double necessity for the left to put back anti-fascism to the core of its agenda, but also to think the necessary actualization of anti-fascism. So we need more anti-fascism for quite obvious reasons, and this anti-fascism will have something to do with interwar anti-fascism. But if we want to be effective, if we want it to be effective, we cannot simply wear the old clothes of anti-fascism. We need to think collectively what could be an anti-fascism for the 21st century. A common understanding of anti-fascism is that fighting fascism is mostly about fighting fascist or proto-fascist organizations, especially through the form of no-platform strategy, supposing a broad coalition of forces that include both reformist and revolutionary organizations. And it has proved efficient in several contexts to block the rise of a militant fascist party rooted in working class neighborhoods and workplaces, for instance, in Britain against the National Front in the late 70s. But even in France, we can think that anti-fascism of the 90s prevent partially the transformation of the National Front into a more militant and rooted party. But as a mostly street-level strategy, it didn't succeed to block the ideological and electoral rise of neo-fascism. And it should be noticed, for instance, that the biggest demonstration and the highest point of anti-fascism of the 90s in France, especially the biggest demonstration one in 1997 in Strasbourg, didn't prevent against the National Front. Didn't prevent the National Front to be on the second turn of the presidential election just a few years after, even after a major split in the organization with Bruno Maigret. So I won't develop this because it would push us too far, but my hypothesis here is that this specific form of anti-fascism can only be successful under specific political conditions, especially I would say, when far-right organizations are still small players in the political field, when the left still appear as some kind of alternative for at least broad sections of the working classes, when the process of fascisation has not begun or is still embryonic, and when the memory of far-right dictatorship is still vivid in the national political cultures. None of these conditions can be found in France today, in my view, which is an explanation for the difficulties faced by the anti-fascist movement for quite a long time. Hence the need also for discussing new strategies. So I would like to highlight a few points on that. My first point is that we should take seriously the fact that the main elements that explain the rise of fascism are not to be found in the far right itself, but in the long-term effects of mainstream neoliberal policies implemented during the last decades, and to the fact that in most Western countries, right-wing and centre-left parties went ideologically more and more on the direction of the far right, giving a growing legitimacy to far-right propaganda, especially, I would say, especially on the French instance, on 3 questions: Islam, migrations, and crime, or what is branded in France as insecurity. It shouldn't be a surprise, because fascism has always been the complex product of, on one hand, the development of far-right movement and ideas, which is the obvious part of the story, and on the other hand, reactionary radicalization of bourgeois parties and sections of the ruling class, which allowed the fascists to come to power by legal means, at least in Italy and Germany. All this means that an anti-fascism that will only be a defense of democracy against the far-right threat, or a street-level fight against fascist thugs, would be dramatically insufficient to face the neo-fascist dynamics. Anti-fascism has to link organically to this fight to actual struggles against especially the authoritarian and racist policies implemented by the ruling class, especially when it radicalizes, as we experience now in France. Otherwise, it's very much unlikely that anti-fascism will be able to attract the most oppressed segments of the working class, because a lot of non-white people, for instance, would say, okay, I haven't been brutalized by fascist thugs. I have been controlled, humiliated, or brutalized by the police. And it's true that the French police killed much more non-white people than the far right in the last decades, almost 700 people in the last 40 years, mostly young Black and Arab males from working class neighborhoods. Muslims could also say that the biggest organization against Islamophobia in France, which was the biggest anti-racist organization for the last 20 years, hasn't been disbanded by fascists, but by Macron's government just 1 year ago. It was the Collective Against the Islamophobia in France, Collectif contre l'Islamophobie en France, CIF. My second point is linked to the first, at least in France, but my guess is that this claim could be relevant in most Western Europe and the US. Islamophobia has not been sufficiently taken into consideration by anti-fascists and by the left, at least mainstream anti-fascists, and also anarchist anti-fascists, for instance. While it has a central role in the rise of neo-fascism, it's a pillar of far-right electoral and ideological successes. It's also a motive for fascist terrorist attacks against Muslims, obviously, but even against Jews and left activists, because in the conspiracy form of Islamophobia, the Jews and the left are presented as those who use Islams and Muslims to destroy the nation, the West, traditional values and identities, and so on. And Islamophobia is a decisive element of the process of fascisation by racializing, demonizing, dehumanizing non-white people living in Western societies, and by providing a motive for the hardening of the state, especially through the constant move towards more arbitrary power to the police. So my point here is very simple, but has been actually very complicated in practice for the French left in the past 20 years, which is the struggle against Islamophobia should be seen not as a thing you do once in a while, but as one of the main tasks for anti-fascism, a central dimension of the anti-fascist fight right now. And if we take this idea seriously, it supposes new alliances, which are rendered very difficult both by the fact that Muslims organizations or anti-Islamophobia organizations are being disbanded by the government. Even like 2 weeks ago, another anti-Islamophobia organization has been disbanded for non-serious motives, and by the fact that the French left has been constantly divided and bad on this question. Some sections of the left participating in the crusade against Muslims, as you must know. My third point is that we should be more careful in looking at the ideological attraction of new fascism and the ways we can fight against it. Obviously, violence is still at the agenda of the far right, as we can see everywhere, especially in India, in the US, Brazil, etc., when militias are organizing and growing. But the main war neo-fascists are waging right now, and for quite a long time, is a cultural one. It's a fact that they won quite a lot of victories on that ground. Some aspects or elements of the fascist ideology became part of the dominant ideology, especially around those questions I mentioned before, Islam, migrations, and crime. If I had the time, I could show how the idea of anti-white racism, which was extremely marginal in the 90s in France, when it was only being defended by Jean-Marie Le Pen, became some sort of self-evident fact in the French public debate, and even considered by some mainstream ideologues as the main form of racism in France today. And it's still a work in progress. For instance, the conspiracy theory of the Great Replacement, which was even more marginal just 5 years ago, even refused by Marine Le Pen, is now being accepted and defended by right-wing leaders and ideologues, and his inventor, Renaud Camus, being invited in the main information channel in France. And my last point, I'm sorry for the time, just 1 minute. My last point is that the rise of the far right shouldn't be understood as a reaction to workers' combativity and a fortiori to revolutionary dynamics, which doesn't seem on the agenda for the near future. The rise of fascism is more delusional and pathological expression of both the hegemonic instability on the side of the ruling class and of the absence of left alternative. And this has effects on the way we conceive anti-fascism too. In the interwar context, anti-fascism was organically linked to the working class movement and was often conceived as a sectorial fight to defend workers' organizations. With the decline of these organizations, anti-fascism has not only lost a massive infrastructure to organize against fascists, it lost what was taken for granted as its natural horizon, socialism. We could complain about this, but I would say a more productive attitude should be to consider anti-fascism as one of the means we have to rebuild this kind of horizon, or one of the major battlefield in which we can try to rebuild an alternative socialist project. I'm sorry for the 2 minutes.
Thanks a lot, Ugo. And now the floor to Alberto.
Thank you, Panayotis, and thank you to all the speakers in this panel for some really brilliant presentations. I suppose what I'll be talking about really focuses on, in Ugo's very helpful cartography, the aspect of ideological or discursive struggles. And the talk is entitled The Fascist Love of Freedom. So in the interminable seesaw of analogies and disanalogies that occupy so much speculation, theoretical and mainstream, about the contemporaneity of fascism, the notion of freedom has played a not insignificant, if at times muted or implicit part. The largely liberal checklist exercises that are a staple of the genre will often identify the exaltation of the state and the repudiation of liberty as constants of historical fascism, and find contemporary movements and ideologies of the right or the far right lacking in that department. Today's revamped authoritarian populisms spawn sundry freedom parties, and liberty is often their leitmotif. Liberty from so-called medical totalitarianism, liberty for and of property ownership, or liberty as a marker of civilizational difference from migrants and their religions. There are choice examples of this trait in Andreas and the Zetkin collective's formidable panorama of an emergent fossil fascism, white skin, black fuel, where we can read, for instance, that, I quote, "The doctrine of energy dominance was annotated with some classical American freedom speak when the Department of Energy in 2019 began to refer to fossil gas as freedom gas, to be exported without constraints around the world. Official documents from this department, still headed by Rick Perry, spoke of fossil fuels as, quote, molecules of US freedom." Elsewhere, we come across, still in the same work, Rainer Kraft, the Alternative for Deutschland's climate spokesman, decrying the fact that mainstream parties are, quote, threatening the end of the world and stirring up mass hysteria so that people will accept that more and more of their property and their freedom are stolen, end of quote. What are the liberal, neoliberal, and libertarian notes in the contemporary discourse of the far right signs of an unbridgeable discontinuity with interwar historical fascisms? What I want briefly to explore in what follows is the proposition that in several ways, conceptions of freedom at both individual and collective levels were not and are not alien to fascism, and that we may gain in our understanding of fascist potentials and subjectivities by tarrying with that apparent oxymoron, fascist freedom. In his recently published White Freedom, The Racial History of an Idea, the historian Tyler Stovall, having traced the racial entanglements of ideologies of liberty across European imperialism, settler colonialism, and plantation slavery, judiciously observes, I quote, that ideas of freedom did play a significant role in the ideology of fascism, which should perhaps not be a surprise given the shaping role that those phenomena I just mentioned, settler colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, played in fascism's self-image. In 1941, Herbert Marcuse declared, I quote, "Under the terror that now threatens the world, the ideal constricts itself to one single and at the same time common issue. Faced with fascist barbarism, everyone knows what freedom means," end of quote. Unfortunately, I think that may not always be the case. Italian fascism's relationship to liberalism itself was by no means purely antagonistic. In the first years of Mussolini's regime, even a figure like Luigi Einaudi, later to become a member of the neoliberal Montpellerin Society and a president of Italy, would welcome the fascist government's efforts at balancing budgets and curbing social spending, writing in 1925 of a, quote, "a period of fruitful return of the Italian tax system to its classic liberal traditions," end of quote. In 1923, the philosopher Giovanni Gentile, in joining the fascist party, would write a letter to Mussolini himself saying, quote, "I have come to be persuaded that liberalism, as I understand it, and as understood by the men of the glorious right who led the Italy of the Risorgimento, the liberalism of freedom in the law and therefore in the strong state and in the state conceived of as an ethical reality, is not today represented in Italy by liberals who are more or less openly against you, but precisely by you," i.e. Mussolini. Mussolini himself would later declare, and this is cited by Stovall in his book White Freedom, quote, "If liberty is to be the attribute of living men and not abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty, and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state," end of quote. In Libre d'Obéir, Free to Obey, his recent book on the Nazi origins of post-war management theories and practices, Johann Chapoutot has incisively explored a deep seam of National Socialist intellectual production, spearheaded by young jurists, some of them members of the SS, which cast severe doubt on the centrality of the state to the project of racial imperialism. For the figures explored by Chapoutot, the state was a counter-selective hindrance to a quote-unquote German freedom, understood as a kind of racial spontaneity capable of creating its own immanent right or law and guiding the flexible, inventive, target-based performances that officers would carry out in freedom and autonomy of means. German freedom, an old leitmotif of German nationalism, harking back to a freedom of the forests, opposed to dry, abstract, impersonal Judeo-Roman laws, is a product of a sui generis racial withering away of the state, which will herald, in the vision of these young jurists, a return to original Germanic models of community beyond individualism, beyond the state, and beyond modern sovereignty. As Chapoutot writes in an earlier book, The Law of Blood, I quote, "According to German positive law as it had existed before 1933, a person was said to be defined by his freedom. The Nazi jurist Karl Larenz denounced this freedom as utterly abstract and negative, because it was often presented as protecting the subject from the state and from others. Larenz asserted that freedom was concrete and positive. He argued that rather than being linked to a status, a notion rooted in a static understanding of the law, freedom was a question of position, that of the, quote from Larenz, legal position of the individual who is no longer a person, but a concrete being member," end of quote. In a seemingly frivolous, if no less disturbing register, Deutsche Leibesucht, the Nazi nudist movement's magazine, argued staunchly that, quote, "nudity in nature is not in any way immoral. Liberated from the shackles imposed on them by civilization and culture, humans could experience freedom and health in all the places nature had to offer," end of quote. This willful retrogression was compatible with an overcoming of bureaucratic principles of administration in view of a fully managerial conception of the exercise of power and violence. As Chapoutot remarked in a recent interview, the National Socialists claimed that those people who implemented their ideas were free in their work. Here again, we see the image that is essential to Nazi ideology. Quote, "We Germans are free. Over in the East, the USSR, that is in Asia, live subhumans that are ruled by Jews with a whip. We Germanic people are different. We are free," end of quote. When one of the main Nazi juridical and organizational intellectuals, Reinhard Höhn, came to play such a prominent role in the post-war period, the shift was not so drastic. Chapoutot continues, Höhn had the advantage of proposing a management theory with a Harzburg model that was adapted to the spirit of the times. His ideas dominated the German business space. This is a quote from Höhn. "We are free as producers, just as we are free as voters or as consumers. We are free, while those over there under communism are unfree," end of quote. In the managerial register that was, according to Chapoutot, birthed by the Nazi non-state, German freedom was defined by a kind of performance principle, such that while the individual SS officer was given maximum autonomy and flexibility in the performance of his mission, the community of the people, the Volksgemeinschaft, and key term in Nazi ideology, was also defined as a Leistungsgemeinschaft, a community of performance or community of achievement. Now, many of Chapouteau's insights, if not his detailed research, were anticipated by Franz Neumann, who references Höhn in his pioneering discussion of the Nazi non-state in Behemoth, also to explain actually Carl Schmitt's marginality to the core of Nazi ideology. And by his friend, Neumann's friend, Herbert Marcuse, who pushed against characterizations of Nazism as a new kind of state capitalism, as well as against the rather undialectical juxtaposition between market society and totalitarianism that some members of the Frankfurt School in exile were articulating in the early 40s. Instead, Marcuse pointed to the complex genetic and structural relation between fascism and liberal capitalism, something he had already begun to sketch out in the 1934 essay on, quote, the struggle against liberalism in the totalitarian vision of the state, where he also noted Ludwig von Mises's notorious references in his 1927 book, Liberalism, to fascism as, quote, a savior of Western civilization, albeit an emergency makeshift to be supplanted by a fortified liberal order. As Marcuse wrote in his 1942 State and Individual Under National Socialism, I quote, the emergence of the Third Reich is the emergence of the most efficient and ruthless competitor. The National Socialist state is not the reversal, but the consummation of competitive individualism, unquote. Now, the very possibility of a fascist freedom and the disturbing demand that it carries to reflect on the abiding potentialities of white, settler colonial, propertied, and masculine figurations of freedom that still pervade our ideological space is foreclosed by the discourse of totalitarianism, even in the latter's most philosophically and historically sophisticated variant, namely in the work of Hannah Arendt, whose recognition elsewhere of the boomerang effect of colonialism should have sensitized her to freedom's racial overdeterminations, even though it did not. For Arendt, it is definitional that, I quote from Origins, totalitarian domination, however, aims at abolishing freedom, even at eliminating human spontaneity in general, and by no means at a restriction of freedom, no matter how tyrannical. While it certainly speaks to the phenomenology of fascist terror, of the camp, Arendt's notion that totalitarianism is the enemy of spontaneity, of that natal capacity, as she puts it, to make a new beginning, understood as the very source of freedom, is perhaps too comforting, exempting us from facing the spontaneities and enjoyments that fascism offers to its managers, its militants, and its minions. If, as she puts it, freedom as inner capacity of man is identical with the capacity to begin, just as freedom as a political reality is identical with a space of movement between men, are we sure that fascism is purely and simply freedom's other? Arendt herself, in fact, introduces some doubts when she declares perceptibly that it is freedom from the content of their own ideologies which characterizes the highest rank of the totalitarian hierarchy. But to conclude, if we wish to tackle the twisted nexus of freedom and fascism, we'll probably have to also probe into the latter's psychic life. In this regard, it is perhaps telling that an effort to depict the psychology of Nazism as a veritable apotheosis of a centuries-long escape from freedom in Erich Fromm's famous and eponymous wartime book also contains a reflection on what appears to be a very contemporary psychosocial type, the authoritarian rebel. For Fromm, such rebels, quote, look like persons who, on the basis of their inner strength and integrity, fight those forces that block their freedom and independence. However, the authoritarian character's fight against authority is essentially defiance. It is an attempt to assert himself and to overcome his own feeling of powerlessness by fighting authority, although the longing for submission remains present, whether consciously or unconsciously. The authoritarian character is never a revolutionary. I should like to call him a rebel. There are many individuals and political movements that are puzzling to the superficial observer because of what seems to be an inexplicable change from radicalism to extreme authoritarianism. Psychologically, these people are the typical rebels. The authoritarian character loves those conditions that limit human freedom. He loves being submitted to fate. End of quote. Is the fascist love of freedom simply a detour on the way to submission? On the way to what around the same time Marcuse called not freedom, but acquiescent license? This is a question that I think anti-fascist theory will still need to meditate, not least as a moment in the clarification of its own philosophy of liberation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Alberto, and for exemplary discipline in regards to time, as a member of the board should display. Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Panagiotis, and thanks to everyone who has talked so far and given really important contributions on this crucial topic. Now, like my fellow Zetkinist Lise, I will focus on the nexus of ecology and the far right today. I just like Sabrina, have endured 2 weeks of COP26, although I wasn't inside the blue zone as Sabrina was. I have to start by commenting a little bit on the current moment of self-congratulation coming out of the ruling class that presided over this COP. This kind of self-congratulation that we see right now, probably most intense since COP21 in Paris, always includes a component of saying no one is anymore denying the problem of the climate crisis. So we have, for instance, Richard Allen, a professor of climate science at the University of Reading, who told The Guardian today that there has been remarkable progress in Glasgow, and he said, I quote, "Less than 10 years ago, the solid science of human-caused climate change was still disputed by agenda-driven individuals and organizations who should be made accountable for their damaging, delaying tactics," end quote. And then this kind of explicit rejection of the science has somehow disappeared, and now we have just experienced COP26. Allen expresses a sense of guarded optimism that a spark of the universe came alive in Glasgow, and we wondered at the beauty of our world and eventually noticed we were soiling it terribly before we imperfectly yet doggedly and collectively began digging ourselves out of our mess. Now, Sabrina, who's I think the only one in the panel who was also in COP26, I'm sure you share Allen's impression of the event that a spark of the universe came alive in Glasgow. It's obviously true that that was exactly what happened. Now, it's as absurd in 2021 as it was in 2015 to say that climate denial isn't happening any longer. And this was precisely what was trumpeted in Paris when the Paris negotiations happened. And not so very long after, we had Donald Trump elected as a president of the United States. Now, obviously, he is out of the White House, and therefore it's easy to get lulled into the sense of security that, okay, this kind of climate denial has now actually disappeared this time, finally, because there is this expectation that it eventually will have to happen. People will have to, because they are somehow rational beings, wake up to the realities of the climate crisis, and therefore climate denial is no longer viable. Lise has already pointed to some of the cases in France, indicating that this isn't exactly the whole picture. It seems to me that this impulse from liberals to deny the existence of climate denial, this denial of denial, is part of the sort of richly textured fabric of various types of climate denial that we try to disentangle and analyze in our book. Of course, the fundamental premise for our discussion of the relation between fascism and fossil fuels and the problem of climate in this conjuncture is that the historical understanding of fascism was that it could only materialize as a real historical force in a situation of deep crisis. Now, it's obvious to me that despite COP26, this climate crisis will only intensify. It will only deepen in the coming years, and therefore we should expect the far right to play an important political role, just as it has in previous episodes of epic crisis in capitalist societies. One form that this still takes is precisely classical climate denial that hasn't really gone out of business. I will focus my comments here on the case of the US, not because the US is inherently particular or unique or special. To the contrary, I will end by giving an example from my own country, Sweden, that indicates just the opposite. But the US is obviously a central country for climate politics, for all sorts of politics, and for climate denial. And the US was quite badly battered this summer by one climate disaster after another: the heat wave in the Pacific Northwest, the wildfires in California, the droughts in the West, the hurricanes in the South, ending with the storm Ida in New York. And throughout the summer, there was one book that consistently topped all the bestseller lists for nonfiction books, and that was a book. I think the URL should be found in YouTube at YouTube now, if Paul has posted it. It's a book called American Marxism by Mark Levin, who is a Fox host show. He has his own program there. He used to run his own, or he does run his own think tank that received money from the Koch brothers and ExxonMobil, at least once upon a time from ExxonMobil. I'm not sure any longer about that particular source. And the book American Marxism sold 700,000 copies within its first 3 weeks. And at the end of this year, this will be the book that most Americans have read, a non-fiction book, to make sense of their reality. It's the magnitude of its bestseller status is just mind-boggling. And the thesis in this book is that Marxists have taken over, or are in the process of taking over, all of American society. So the book begins by Levin saying that there is a movement that can no longer be dismissed or ignored, for it is devouring our society and culture, swirling around our everyday lives, and ubiquitous in our politics, schools, media, and entertainment. Once a mostly unrelatable fringe and subterranean movement, it is here, it is everywhere. You, your children, and your grandchildren are now immersed in it, and it threatens to destroy the greatest nation ever established, along with your freedom, family, and security. And the movement that he's talking about here is Marxism. And we as Marxists would perhaps find it a little bit difficult to recognize this picture of our absolute omnipotence in American society, or any other society for that matter. It's almost, I mean, it would be great if it had some kind of truth content to it, but it's difficult to see that it has. And it's almost as if there is an inverse relation between the actual power that Marxists exercise in history and the ideas and the prevalence and the popularity of the ideas about our omnipotence, or our almighty subversion of American society. It really is something delusional going on here, just as Hugo said. And what's remarkable here is precisely the complete absence of a real revolutionary threat, corresponding to this obsessive preoccupation with a Marxist takeover. Yeah. Now, I should add that Mark Levin, who's now America's most trusted expert on Marxism, isn't that well informed about the subject. He keeps referring to the Franklin School of Critical Theory coming out of Berlin. He does this consistently in the book and in various media appearances as well. He also refers to material historicism, otherwise known as historical materialism. And errors of that kind are repeated very abundantly in this marvelous book. I recommend everyone to read it just for purposes of entertainment, although it's also quite dystopian in a sense, because it's just so totally nuts. Now, as you can see in the table of contents, if you open it on your computer screens, there are two main chapters of this book, 4 and 5, and the fourth chapter, called Racism, Genderism, and Marxism, focuses on a little bit of course, on trans issue and feminism, but very heavily on critical race theory. And the fifth chapter is called Climate Change, Fanaticism, with climate change within scare quotes. And this book quite persistently harps on the theme of race and climate as the two hooks that the Marxists use to, you know, drive their power into the flesh of American society. The standard tropes of climate denialism are completely hackneyed. We've heard them for decades. There's nothing new there. But the combination, the very close integration between themes of race and climate, I think, are a little bit new. They're more explicit than they used to be in this book. Now, if you continue down this rabbit hole, you can find another book by Mark Morano called Green Fraud: Why the Green New Deal is Even Worse Than You Think. Mark Morano is the arch denialist, funded up to his heads by money from the fossil fuel companies. And in this, again, extremely popular book, he is repeating all the classical tropes of climate denialism while focusing on AOC as a kind of witch, super witch of the green fraud. And this book is blurbed by Mark Levin and many others on the American right. Now, if you take another step down this rabbit hole, you find a really a gem of a book that is the last of the third URLs that you can find here. The Weaponization of Weather in the Phony Climate War by Joe Bastardi, who is sort of the Joe Exotic of climate denial. And it doesn't take much critical theory to spot what is going on here, what kind of freedom he's trying to defend, this guy. The whiteness and the masculinity that he performs on the marvelous, to me, I think, unsurpassable cover of this book. Yeah, so I sort of like these things. I just want to say that Sabrina and I had a conversation with Kate Aronoff, a great comrade from the US, and when I asked her about her prediction for the next few years in the US, she said that she thinks that the Democrats will lose the House and they will lose the whole Congress. And there's no doubt that Donald Trump, if he's still alive in 2024, will be the Republican presidential candidate. And then she thought that it's highly likely that even if he actually loses the vote in that election, the Republicans controlling the Congress will not endorse his defeat, but will rather say that he is going to, he was the actual winner of the election, whatever the results would have been. So her prediction was that in 2024, we'll have Donald Trump again. And it will perhaps be even crazier then, will be deeper into the climate crisis. And a second victory of Donald Trump, if that were to happen, or any other Republican candidates, all of them that you know are eligible for this position are totally invested into climate denial. Such a Republican victory would come more thoroughly at the expense of what remains of bourgeois democracy in the US. Obviously, this isn't in any way predestined to happen, but it's a scenario that we cannot rule out. Now, my fundamental argument here is that the ideas represented by a climate denialist far right have not disappeared. They are incredibly influential in US politics. A recent poll showed that 45% of Americans still do not think that anthropogenic climate change exists. And this is also a political force that is highly potent in Europe itself. And I'm going to sort of move to a different register in my remaining minutes. Do I have something like 2 minutes left, or? Yeah. Yeah, so I can't resist the temptation to tell you a sort of an anecdote, and I'm very regretful that I didn't look into this before while we were working on White Skin Black Fuel, because it fits the arguments that we are making there so well. But our collective is an ongoing project, so I hope that we can look deeper into this. So in the book, we are trying to look into the links between fossil fuels and fascism historically and in the present and potentially in the future. And here's the story. The country of Sweden isn't known for its fascist politics in the interwar period, nor for its fossil fuels. But it has one big oil company, and that is Lundin Energy. It used to be called Lundin Oil, then Lundin Petroleum, now it's called Lundin Energy. This company was founded by a man called Adolf H. Lundin, born in 1932. His family was a family of Nazi sympathizers. The family on his mother's side were German aristocrats who apparently fled Odessa after the Russian Revolution. And his uncle, Willy von Wagner, was such a passionate Nazi that he enrolled in the Nazi occupation forces in Norway, where he was killed by partisans in 1943. And in the 1970s, the son here, Adolf H. Lundin, formed this oil company that also engaged in the extraction of gas and gold and other minerals, including gold in South Africa. He was a great friend of the apartheid regime. He remained a rabid anti-communist throughout his life. He was active in the US for a while and worked for the Heritage Foundation, a key think tank in the organization of climate denial. He was close to Reagan, whose campaign in 1980 he sponsored. And 3 days ago, a very unusual court case opened in Sweden, where Adolf H's son, the current CEO of Lundin, and his closest collaborator were charged with assisting in serious war crimes in Sudan, where in the late 1990s and early 2000s, this company was instrumental in having villages razed and women raped and lots of people killed for clearing Sudanese territory for their oil extraction. Now, this company is one of the main players in the Norwegian oil and gas industry. So there was a sort of return of the Lundin family to Norway a couple of decades ago, not as Nazi occupiers, but as oil prospectors. And it was Lundin energy company that discovered the which is the largest owner of the field. So here we have the descendants. I mean, obviously we need to look.
Okay, I think that Andreas is facing a problem with his connection. When he comes back, I hope that he will finish this really interesting story. Anyway, okay, so to avoid awkward silences and delays, I would suggest that we move to the questions part, and this will give time to Andreas to fix his connection, unless he has already fixed it. Andreas, can you speak now? No, okay. So anyway, and I suppose as part of the question and answers part of the panel, Andreas will, Andreas, can you finish your story?
I was essentially done. It broke off just when I was done. I'm terribly sorry.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's go to the questions. Which, well, I would like to ask our viewers to post questions and comments. In the meantime, I would like to pose one or two questions if anyone wants to respond, and we have some time so that at least until our viewers post questions. I mean, there is a question. I mean, it's for the entire panel. Whoever wants to respond, and the question is, how can we describe in contemporary terms whether we can talk about continuity or discontinuity between all these fascist tendencies that we have talked about, and the mainstream political spectrum, or to use the European expression, the constitutional arc parties. That is, to what extent is all these forms of fascism that we have discussed, in a discontinuity or more in a continuity with mainstream politics, and what this means both for anti-fascist struggle and also how we also view mainstream systemic bourgeois parties. This is a question. To what extent fascist tendencies we're talking about are distinct, or are outsiders of the political system, or not so much any longer. So anyone who wants to pick up this question until we get some real questions from our viewers.
Yeah, maybe I'll say something though. I think, at least from my knowledge of his work, I know that Ugo has a lot to say about this, certainly in terms of the French context. But I guess we can maybe identify at least a rough pattern of situations in which, as I think indeed Ugo already suggested, the role of far-right parties, certainly with fascist potentials, components, or ingredients, has been to impel the shift of that arc and of that spectrum in an increasingly xenophobic, authoritarian, and indeed specifically in European cases, xenophobic direction. That has also, in other situations, right, led to a mainstreaming or an integration. I mean, the Italian case with Lega, to me, is an obvious one, right? Where that was at the core of the political
Okay.
Sorry, did I totally cut out?
Just the last,
okay.
If you can repeat your last phrase.
No, just that I think then the other pattern has been of an explicit, mainstreaming, like in the Italian case. And then I guess we can ask both historically and maybe even sociologically why it is, right, that sometimes these processes take place with the explicitly far movement playing an auxiliary and external support role, right, to give caution and credence for movements on the right, to say that they have to fill that space, right? Like that's the usual, in order to prevent, right? Like, so, because sometimes that's the discourse. In order to prevent the fascizations, we have to, expel the migrants, impose police measures and the like. And then other cases in which this is instead just come straight into the political mainstream, where I think, at least in the European context, I think the case of at least in the Western European context, the case of Salvini was probably the most emblematic. But yeah, maybe Ugo wants to.
Ugo, do you want to?
Yeah, there would be a lot of things to say, but I would just say one thing, more or less, reminding that one of the ideological cause of fascism is a mix of order and subversion. I mean, one of the main narrative of the far right is we're going to subvert the order to restore the true order. So I would say one of the reasons of their successes is that this they make a double and complex and constant appeal to the masses, an appeal to the order and an appeal to the subversion. And so, for example, what happened with the declaration that were made by military people in France, it was just perfect for the far right because it was driven by far right people inside the army. But it was an institution which epitomized the order, the social order, and also they were subverting the order by inside the order. So it was just perfect. But so we have constantly processes of mainstreaming the extreme and extremizing the mainstream. And Zemmour is really a perfect instance of that, because he's really like extremizing and clarifying actually the fascist core of Le Pen ideology, for instance. So he's saying really more radical and dirty stuff about the migrants, and they're all rapists, they're all these kind of things. And on the other side is really more acceptable for sections of the right-wing, traditional right-wing electorate and traditional right-wing leaders. And so he's mainstreaming the extreme, and also extremizing the mainstream. For instance, on what I was talking about, the Great Replacement, is one of the players on this battlefield. I mean, he's really like mainstreaming this idea for quite a lot of years. So so there's no simple answer to this question of continuity and discontinuity. The fascists are playing on. They are inside and outside, and that's the one of the problems for the left, actually, and for anti-fascists, I would say.
Thanks a lot. Anyone else who wants to come back, not only on this question, but also to comment or engage with what has already been presented? Yes, Lise.
Yeah, I can just say on the question of continuity, like more like if we think of continuity of ideas, what we see in far right ecology is that there are a lot of eco-fascist groups, and just generally this far right view on the land and the people is very much fueled by the Nazi ideology of blood and soil, and how the connection between natural people inhabiting the natural territory, and the romanticization of the rural. And I think it would be even more important now, but we already do it in the book, to remind that Nazis were not ecologists. Yes, they had a permaculture garden or herbal gardens in concentration camps, but they leave behind and war industry that was not ecologist and or that was not green in any ways. So it's not because Hitler was an animal lover and vegetarian that Nazis were green. They were not.
Thanks a lot, Lise. Andres or Sabrina? Andres, yes. Andres, do you want to respond? No. Okay.
No.
Okay. Sabrina? Sabrina has some problems with her internet connection, at least for holders. Okay. So, don't have any. Okay, we don't have any questions from our viewers, which I suppose in a certain way also means that they are still, thinking about what they have heard, because it was indeed a very rich panel, which actually gave lots of things to think about in regards to both the forms that fascism takes in the contemporary conjuncture, its particular relation to questions regarding ecology and also fossil capital, and of course the difficult challenges for anyone trying to rethink anti-fascist struggle, but at the same time I suppose it also poses the challenge of that actually an anti-fascism can only be in a certain way anti-capitalist, exactly to also address the more systemic aspect of fascism. Anyway, anyone from the panel who wants to say any final comments or suggestions or declarations or anything? Okay.
Maybe just to say for people who are following this, that there were a series of interventions and discussions actually started off by an article by Ugo on the historical materialism list with pieces by Robin Marasco and Ken Kawashima and Gavin Walker and others. So, certainly for debates about the vitality and urgency of theories of fascism and anti-fascism, obviously there's the debate ranges far, including very much in Andreas and the Collective's book, but I also would direct listeners to some of those articles as well.
Yes, thanks Alberto for mentioning all this. Both Ugo and the Zetkin Collective have really done a great work in the past years, and reopening these debates and gathering all the relevant aspects, especially in a certain way, offering us a really broader spectrum of all these tendencies. And we must be really grateful. Please, it's important to follow these debates. These are not just theoretical debates. These are vital debates in regards to our political practice and also the survival of emancipatory political projects. Anyway, since we don't have any other questions, and since we're already at about 100 minutes of discussion, I think that we can, end it here. And I think it was a great way to end the conference with a great panel with important interventions, and just to mention from people who are not just theorists, also they are also activists, also engaged in concrete struggles. And this brings us also to the end of the conference. So again, many thanks to everyone who presented at this conference. Many thanks to all the persons who one way or the other contributed to making this conference possible, from Haymarket to everyone involved in the technical aspects of it, and of course to everyone who actually watched it and commented and participated. And we hope that even with all the technical and not so technical limitations of Zoom conferences and YouTube streams, we managed to continue this project of using the conferences to create a broader community of Marxist discussion, not just in terms of abstract theorizing, but also in terms of rethinking the challenges we face in real struggles. And so please keep supporting the historical materialism project. Stay tuned for the next round of conferences, which beginning with HM Istanbul, which is going to be an in-person conference in mid-April in 2022, and hopefully next London next November. We still have lots to discuss, lots to debate, and above all, lots to struggle for. Again, many thanks, keep the struggle, and have a good evening, afternoon, or night.